Hey everybody, welcome to episode 4 in our series on rhetoric. This one is on logos. And I want to remind you that we are talking about James Baldwin's letter to his nephew. This is sometimes called My Dungeon Shook. It is the first link down below in the description. If you haven't read it, you really should read it before you move. Wait, why is everybody laughing? What's so funny? Why won't anybody tell me what's so funny? Ah, forget it. Just play the theme song. You get it? The Logos movie. Legos? Logos? Legos? That's enough. Movie magic! Well, that was fun. I hope you enjoyed it because it was the entire special effects budget for the year. We're going to do a real quick recap. We are in our series about rhetoric. Rhetoric is the set of tools that writers and speakers use to make their arguments more persuasive. We covered a number of things. We talked about the rhetorical triangle. We talked about the rhetorical context, which is the circle part there. We covered one angle of the triangle, which is ethos appeals. An author trying to establish his or her credibility. We covered another angle of the triangle, which is pathos appeals. This is where writers or speakers are purposely trying to manipulate your emotions to make their arguments more effectively. And now we come to the third angle of the triangle, which is logos. Logos is the evidentiary or logical support to an argument. Logos appeals basically go to, here are some facts, here are some reasons, here are some examples, here is a set of logical conclusions that you can come to based on the evidence. And that's what we're going to be talking about. And I know in the previous 2 episodes I spent some time talking about how popular culture kind of manipulates your emotions or establishes credibility. And when we get a little bit later on, I will mention a very popular culture character. But we're not going to start there. We are just going to kind of dive right in to logos and how James Baldwin constructs his logos appeals. And to do this, I need to talk about how some logos appeals are really easy. There are some logos appeals that are kind of medium and some logos appeals that are kind of hard. And lucky for you, we actually have already covered the easy logos appeals here at Bullock's Rules for Writing. If you've seen series 3, which is the series on argument, you learned about evidence, and you perhaps have learned the acronym ROW, that your evidence should come from your readings, observations, and experience. And I'm going to pause here to say what I did say back in series 3 about evidence, which is that many times I get students who firmly believe that they're using personal experience, or they're using experience evidence, when in fact they're creating an entirely hypothetical scenario. And it might be something like, let's say you walk into a store and the clerk starts following you around because the clerk thinks you're going to steal something. That example, constructed in that way, is not real. You know, anything that begins with let's say, or sometimes you might, or anything like that, those are hypothetical examples. And while it is absolutely true that people do get followed around at the store because clerks might think they're going to steal something, if you just talk about it as a hypothetical or a possible or a maybe or a sometimes, it doesn't really have a lot of punch when it comes to providing evidence. So if something like that has happened to you, you went into the store and a clerk was following you around because the clerk thought you were going to steal something, tell that story. One day I went to Foot Locker and blah, blah, blah. Okay? If it hasn't happened to you, maybe it's happened to someone you know. And if it hasn't happened to you or someone you know, then maybe think about an example you may have heard about in the news. So it becomes not an evidence appeal, but an observation appeal. The takeaway about Roe and about the easy level of logos appeals, about it's just evidence, it's just facts, is its concreteness. We're going to talk in a few minutes about things that are more abstract, talking about analogies and deductive reasoning. We'll get to the abstract, but when you're thinking about this level of logos appeal, it has to be hard, concrete fact. And James Baldwin, in his letter to his nephew, does this in a number of places. We talked in the previous episode, for example, about paragraph 4, where Baldwin makes specific reference, an allusion with an A. Baldwin makes reference to the novels of Charles Dickens and the London that Dickens described. This is also an example of readings evidence. And you might be sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, how can it be both a pathos appeal and a logos appeal? Well, okay. Sometimes things can be two things. And, let's go back to can we get the triangle? There you go. When you look at this rhetorical triangle, the reason why people like me draw it as a triangle is because all of these appeals are really related. If an audience doesn't trust you, they're not going to care enough to have their emotions manipulated. If an audience doesn't feel an emotional connection to the stories that you're telling and the facts that you're providing, they're not going to care that these are true stories and real facts. So yeah, in the case of the allusion to Charles Dickens, that is two things. Now, of course, Baldwin doesn't stop with the evidence. Once he's dropped in a couple of references to history and to literature, he also digs in with some pretty powerful observational evidence. You might remember paragraph 3, where, it's really where Baldwin's thesis lies. He's got this great sentence: "They have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives." This is something that Baldwin has seen in the culture around him. The way whites have constructed a reality for themselves and for the African Americans has deeply, deeply hurt the African American community. And that paragraph 3 is not the only place that Baldwin drops in some observational evidence. You may remember from the episode, a couple episodes ago, about ethos appeals, paragraph 6 is full of "you," where he is talking to his nephew about what that nephew has experienced. These are all of the things that have happened to you. That's the paragraph that begins with, "You were born into a ghetto in which you were intended to perish." And it goes on from there. Here are the other things that are happening right now in America, in our cities, to African Americans. But all of those things, not only do they bolster his ethos appeal and his credibility, that's also a pretty solid piece of observational evidence. This is what is happening right now. And speaking of the ethos appeals, you probably remember when I talked about paragraph 4, where Baldwin says, "I was there. I know what the conditions were." So he's not afraid also to bring his personal experience into this text. All right, I said that we would leave the concrete for the more inferential or the more abstract parts of a logos appeal. And here we go. This is the medium level. And this is where the analogy and the if-then statement really come into play. I'm going to start with analogy. Can we get a definition? Good. Analogy is when you are comparing a new, unfamiliar situation to an old, familiar one. On the AP English Language exam, and that's the course that I teach, I know it pretty well, there's an argument question, and the readers will sometimes refer to the argument question as the Hitler question, not because they hate reading it, but because students looking for an analogy, looking for something to compare the unfamiliar situation that the question has presented them with to something familiar, will reach for Hitler as the analogy. And let's just be upfront about this. I'm going to say it and then I'm going to move on. Don't do that. Never do that. There was exactly one person who was like Hitler, and that was Hitler. There was exactly one event in history that was like the Holocaust, and that was the Holocaust. Okay? That's it. Just don't. But do make analogies when it becomes appropriate. And to talk about how Baldwin does this, I have said previously that it's really hard to pick one part of this text that I like the most. And I'm not saying that it makes me happy that, I like this text, because it's not a pleasant thing to read. But Baldwin does some amazing things with language and with analogy. Take a look at the middle of paragraph 9. Try to imagine how you would feel if you woke up one morning to find the sun shivering and the stars all aflame. You would be frightened because it is out of the order of nature. Any upheaval in the universe is terrifying because it so profoundly attacks one's sense of one's own reality. Well, the black man has functioned in the white man's world as a fixed star, as an immovable pillar, and as he moves out of his place, heaven and earth are shaken to their foundations. That is an amazing passage. That is just an amazing couple of sentences, because I don't think that I have ever read before Baldwin, after Baldwin, all respect to Ta-Nehisi Coates, but this is the one. This is the clearest description I have ever read of what happens, what is happening in America as African Americans come towards equality, move towards equality. It's not that the white man is being brought down, it's that comparatively, the white man looks not as good because the black man is finally coming. This is what Baldwin is talking about here. And the analogy is clear in a couple of ways. He calls the black man a fixed star, an immovable pillar. So this suggestion that the equality and the well-being of African Americans can shift, that the power dynamic can shift, that the relationship that has existed between the white man and the black man all of these centuries is changing. He says that notion is just as crazy as to imagine that the North Star, the one that is always there in the same place, that the North Star is suddenly way over there. It's again, you can tell because I'm kind of sputtering that this is a beautifully written passage that makes Baldwin's argument more clearly than just about anything else that he wrote in this text, and it's all because of the perfect analogy for the situation. And that brings us around to if-then statements. Now, I know I said just a few minutes ago not to create hypothetical situations. And I want to be clear about the difference between that, let's say you go to the store and you get followed around by that kind of situation, and the if-thens that become powerful pieces of logical appeals. The difference is that if you say this real thing that really happens is just hypothetical, you are taking the air out of a situation. You are completely weakening it. You're bringing it down. You're not helping your argument. On the other hand, when you are posing a hypothetical that this is the situation now, and we have this path, or we have that path, or even this was the situation in the past, and we had this path, we have had this path, and you start talking about what happens with the other path, that is the appropriate time to use an if-then statement or an if-then construction. And you might be thinking, as a lot of people do, about politics and the whole, if we elect candidate X, great things will happen. Or if we elect candidate Y, terrible things will happen. Those tropes are real and they get used a lot because they can be effective. You know, it really is sort of laying out that we are at a moment of decision, Robert Frost style, and we have to decide what path to go. Or we were at a moment of decision and we had to decide what path to be on. And this is what would have happened if we'd taken the other one. And it's that, the sort of if-then based in the past, that Baldwin uses in paragraph 5. If we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. And now you must survive because we love you, and for the sake of your children and your children's children. You, my nephew James, you need to be there for family, for your children and for your grandchildren, because if you are not strong and if you are not hanging together, then all of these things that I've been describing and that I'm going to describe are going to tear you apart. They're going to tear your family apart. So that is not some real thing that happened phrased as a hypothetical. That is a real possibility. It was the path not taken that is then used as a powerful if-then statement to let the nephew James know the importance of family love in this moment of civil rights upheaval. And that brings us, as promised, to the hard level of logos appeals, and that's formal deductive logic or formal deductive reasoning. It's usually done in a formal argument through a syllogism or an enthymeme. And in fact, even in many informal arguments, kind of like this letter to Baldwin's nephew, you see syllogisms or enthymemes, and maybe you don't know what those are. You've probably, perhaps, never heard of syllogisms or enthymemes before. And you know what? That's okay. And if this video is the only time you ever hear of syllogisms and enthymemes, that's also okay. Because when we're talking about formal deductive reasoning, you don't need to really understand that this technical term is, the thing. You just need to understand the thing. And the thing is deductive reasoning. It's where you deduce something about a specific case based on general principles. I mean, that's what deductive reasoning is testing specific instances or specific cases against things that you know to be generally true, or generally it's a rule of the world, the way the world works. It is perhaps best illustrated by the world's most famous deductive logic user, and that's Sherlock Holmes. He was, of course, a fictional character, but all of the revivals, it seems like every couple of years there's a new version of Sherlock Holmes hanging out. It suggests something popular about the character, and what makes him a really good detective is not the heroin abuse or the deer hunter hat. Really, I mean, you should read the original things. He was a horrible drug user. But it's his encyclopedic knowledge of the world. Holmes knows everything. He has general principles falling out of his ears. And so when he's presented with one specific case, with one thing, with one clue, he can say, you know what? X is here. We see X. Dr. Watson, you're standing right next to me and you see X just as I see X. But that means Y. Because when you have X, Y is always present, or Y is usually present. Holmes is taking those individual cases, and literally they're the cases that he takes, and comparing them to what is generally true, to what is a general principle about the world, and then he's able to solve the crimes. Now, to see deductive reasoning in action in the Baldwin text, look again at paragraph 4. Baldwin says in that paragraph that his mother is not bitter. She's not a bitter woman. But he also says that the critics of people like Baldwin, who are saying that the world is terrible for African Americans and civil rights is a struggle that needs to be going on, those critics, the white man, will say, "Oh, Mr. Baldwin, you're just bitter. That something has happened. You're just bitter, and so you're complaining about all of the. You're just bitter." So Baldwin says, "But my mother, your grandmother, she's not bitter, and she has the same experiences, and she has the same complaints. So therefore, Mr. White Man critic, not everyone who's advocating for civil rights, or not everyone who's describing these terrible conditions in which African Americans live, not every one of those people is bitter. You cannot dismiss these criticisms with a wave of the hand and the word bitter. And what Baldwin has done there is he's used an example of a syllogism. A syllogism is a formal 3-step process where you state a general principle about the world, you state the specific case that is to be tested against that general principle, and you come to a conclusion. The 3 steps. And to make those steps clearer, I will use perhaps the world's most famous syllogism, famous because it was written 2,500 years ago, and it goes like this. All human beings are mortal. All human beings are going to die. So you, Mr. Teenager, you may think you're immortal, but you're not. Wear a helmet. That's what I'm trying to say. All human beings are mortal. That's step 1. That is a general principle, a general truth about the world. Step 2, Socrates is a human being. Okay, there's our specific case, the one person named Socrates. The conclusion that we can draw based on those 2 statements is, well, therefore, Socrates is mortal. If all human beings are mortal and Socrates is a human being, then Socrates is mortal. That is the most basic, most formal way to write a syllogism. And of course that gets abused. There's the old joke about how God is love, love is blind, Ray Charles is blind, therefore Ray Charles is God. And look, I'm not going to argue that Ray Charles was, he was great at what he did, and all props to him, but I don't think he was the almighty. Let's just make sure that that's clear. But we could rewrite what Baldwin does as that kind of a syllogism. It would be something like this. All critics of the way things are going in the life that African Americans lead, all critics are bitter. Your grandmother, my nephew James, my mother, your grandmother is not bitter. Therefore, the complainers are not all just bitter. And that about wraps it up for this episode on logos appeals. It's really, I've said in the 2 previous episodes about ethos appeals and pathos appeals that there are 2 things to keep in mind. One is that these things exist, and 2 is that you should be using them. And the same thing is true here, right? Logos appeals exist. You should look for them. You should look for how the authors you read or the speakers you listen to are using evidence, how they're using analogy or posing if-then statements, how they're using formal logical structures by testing a specific case about a general principle in the world. And by the way, when you're talking about that kind of thing, and this is something we'll get into in the later series on argument, you may decide to challenge authors that say, no, this general principle about the world that you are saying is true is actually not true, which is, what Baldwin just said by explaining that his mother is not bitter. So clearly this general principle, Mr. Whiteman, that you believe in is not true. But then, the second takeaway is that, hey, you should be using these things when you are writing an argument, whether it's you're poking fun at people on Facebook, because let's admit it, that's fun, we all do that, or whether you are actually trying to write a real argument that's going to change real people's minds, or even if you're just trying to finish an assignment for your English class. You have these tools at your disposal. You can use reading evidence, observation evidence, experience evidence. You can use good analogies and if-then statements. You can use formal deductive logic by stating that principle about the world and then testing your specific case against it. There is one more episode to come in this series, because as much fun as the appeals are, they are not the entirety of the tools that writers have to make their arguments more convincing. There are also some structural things and some syntactic things and some things related to diction that authors can do and do. Yeah, I know, I said do. And we'll talk about those when I see you for the next one. James Baldwin, in his letter to his nephew, has some very I'm just going to do that again.